I'm a bit worried how much time you've been spending with Father Martin. I hope you haven't been letting him confuse you with all his holier-than-thou Bible thumping. No offense to the man, but I sometimes worry he might just be a little bit crazy. It's understandable. People get scared. They're as like to turn to God as anything else. God died with the gold standard. We're on to a more concrete faith now. This is profit, pure and simple. You have to rob Paul to pay Peter. There's no other way. Murder is the simplest form, but what happens when all the money's gone? Well, money becomes a matter of faith. And that's what I'm here for. Make you believe. Little pig.
Mountain Massive Asylum shocked the horror community in 2013 when the nightmares trapped within its walls were unleashed upon Miles Upshur, a hungry journalist eager to uncover a story about the shady company Murkoff. Outlast made headlines in September of that very year when Windows players got their hands on it, with Xbox and PS4 users getting it several months later. Red Barrel Studios formed in 2011 by former EA and Ubisoft employees after their attempts to have a horror game made internally within those studios failed. They decided to say fuck you then, and they created their own company, and good for them. If it isn't obvious by now, the bold move favored their creative aspirations, allowing them to make more titles under the Outlast IP due to the first game's success. Since 2013, they have created a sequel, Outlast 2, and are now developing a third title called The Outlast Trials. It's undisputable that their first title as an indie studio was huge. I attribute this to not only how great the game is, but the fact that it released at a time when the industry was starting to stagnate in the genre. Many of the big name franchises were parting from their horror roots to chase more action, a decision that many fans voiced their concerns over. I'm looking at you, Resident Evil and Dead Space. Red Barrels decided to do a 180 from many of its competitors by completely stripping the player of any means of protection in the pursuit of a hide-and-seek formula with tense action and spurts of chase sequences. It makes sense that a major inspiration for their anti-combat approach came from Frictional Games' famous Amnesia title. Though its inspiration is clear, Outlast has its own distinct identity thanks to its adoption of the night vision camera, an item that became a horror staple in the mid to late 2000s. Because of movies like Wreck, Red Barrels would quickly become a household name within the market. Though it's hard to imagine Outlast without the camera, it's not the only thing that the game did exceptionally well. The story centers around Miles Upshur as he makes his way through hell to expose the Murkoff Corporation, a company with a historically shady past. Mount Massive Asylum reopened when Murkoff bought it under the guise of charitable endeavors, a claim that was all too common when they were in fact partaking in illegal and unethical behavior. Miles is tipped off via a whistleblower within the company, claiming that experiments are being conducted at the cost of people's well-being for the purpose of obtaining money. With this new lead, he packs his things and makes his way into the asylum to find nobody home. Little does he know that dangerous, mentally unstable patients known as variants roam freely. The chain of command has been dismantled, leaving behind death in its wake. The variants aren't the only thing Miles must contend with. An almost urban legend-like monster known as the Walrider stalks the asylum's halls. The level of depth in the environment and the atmosphere it evokes is in and of itself enough to make the game stand tall among its contemporaries. From the first few steps into the madhouse, you can immediately distinguish that something is off. Despite the claims of it being owned by a large corporation, it looks abandoned. That is, until this happens. And this. The level of detail put into the environments is incredible, with attention to detail like Miles tracking blood from dead bodies. This detail still makes me smile to this day. The tight hallways and dark interiors make traversing this game world a little anxiety-inducing. The phenomenal sound design does wonders in this regard. Everything from the floorboards creaking beneath your body's weight to the haunting sounds of phones left hanging off the hook post-disaster. You can't listen to this and tell me that it isn't labored with love. Gameplay very much follows the route of a hide-and-seek mixed with stealth and heavy action sequences where you must flee from pursuing assailants. All this works pretty well. Miles' movements feel grounded with elements taken into consideration like his body weight. It feels appropriately hefty without hindering movement. How the game handles its first-person angle, allowing the player to see their entire body, also adds to that realism, and is also the first game to actually nail this POV. Welcomed additions like being able to lean left and right around corners and the ability to look behind you while running were useful. Night vision mode is the only thing that drains the camera's battery, so you're able to have the camera up the entire game, but you also have the option to put it down at any moment. Hiding and running are the name of the game here. Mount Massive is an astonishingly well-built game world, just begging to be explored. Exploration is a natural part of the gameplay, as players must rely fully on their camera to navigate the game's many dark environments. If you want to use the camera, you better be on the lookout for batteries. If you don't use these wisely, you'll find yourself in a pretty unforgiving situation. Scouring every nook and cranny will also lead you to the discovery of notes pertaining to Murkoff's various experiments and key subjects that the player will run into throughout the game's runtime. These notes are all really well written with a lot of depth for anyone interested in expanding the lore. Now, if you're not here for the story, the good news is Red Barrel's made a point to allow players to choose whether or not they want to engage in the world story. Even if you don't read these, by the end of the game you'll have a decent idea of what is going on. Now, before we get too far ahead, let's back up to key subjects, because this game has an unsettling range of memorable and twisted characters. Names like Chris Walker, Father Martin, Dr. Traeger, and the twins will stick with you long after the game's credits roll, each with their own personalities and unforgettable encounters. These must be some of the best antagonists in any horror game. Yeah, that's a bold statement, but I'm sticking to it. A scene where you're captured by Traeger is a great highlight. Although his physical appearance is repulsive, he seems to maintain a somewhat sound mind with deep cognitive thought and is unlike the other variants. Through this little stroll, it becomes apparent that we are in his turf as he sadistically mocks you and spouts off about philosophical BS.
You know, I love the mountain air up here at night. You want to head out and take a stroll? Go ahead, I'll wait here. Go on, run free. I'm in no hurry.
I can hear his voice in my head just thinking about playing this game. Because the bulk of the game places you in various parts of the asylum, you'd think that the environments would get rather dull, but there's actually a surprising amount of variety within its setting. Yes, the colors are a little drab with dull whites, grays, and browns, but it fits the tone they were going for. Throughout its roughly 6 to 8 hour campaign, you'll come across flooded basements, rundown cell blocks, commissary areas, and an underground lab. The underground lab being quite the contrast from the rest of the game's other filth-ridden areas. Outlast is not afraid to shy away from unforgettable themes. These consist of mental illness, cannibalism, necrophilia, and more. Yes, there's more. Some of these are talked about or mentioned in documents, while others are shown outright. I gotta give props to Red Barrels for their commitment to making the game consistently uncomfortable. In the context of its story, the sheer darkness of its themes stem from Murkoff's experiment, the morphogenic engine, a tool which requires deeply troubled individuals on the verge of total mental collapse to control nanobots through a prolonged lucid dream-like state. Yeah, that's pretty deep, eh? Mount Massive Asylum makes you feel like you're the only one not walking around with your Johnson now, but for some reason your pants are just hanging on by a thread. I don't know why, but for some reason Outlast has an undescribable charm to it. Like Dead Space, it captured that lightning in a bottle that's so hard to build a momentum around. They tried it with Outlast 2, but that's a video for another time. Right now, I'm gonna try my best to put my thoughts into words. Why is Outlast so special? Quite honestly, no game since the release of Outlast has been able to build this kind of hopeless dread in me. I think it's mainly because although there are fictional elements here, asylums and places of that nature often abused and mistreated people that were severely misunderstood and didn't have a voice. Mount Massive's real-world counterparts are often uninviting and foreboding. Not to mention, a lot of them did unethical experiments to patients on their own accord. There's a reason a vast majority of them are boarded up today. Because of this, its real-world influences did it wonders in terms of its immersion. Adding to that are the game's impressive visuals. The character models have aged, but the environment still looks staggeringly real. Walking the halls of this craze-infested house for the mentally ill quite ironically starts to make you question your own sanity. I already mentioned the impressive sound design, but the soundtrack scored by Samuel Laflamme, sorry if I butchered that, but the soundtrack is powerfully haunting. The orchestral OS puts a lot of attention to violins and trombones. Sure, the gameplay may not be the most exciting or varied, but where gameplay lacks the intense suppressive atmosphere more than makes up for it. A lot of people complain about its reliance on jump scares, and I can't say I agree. Many games use jump scares as a cheap way to knock the player off their element. While Outlast does have some of these, a lot of these leave a lasting impression on the player. For example, when you first enter the asylum in the dead of night, it looks abandoned, and you don't yet fully grasp what deep shit you're in until this happens.
They killed us. They got out. The variants. You can't fight them.
This is a holy shit moment, letting you know right off the bat that things are going to get out of hand. There are honestly very few parts of this game that I dislike. For starters, there are quite a few chase sequences which task you with fleeing from your assailants, but it's kind of ambiguous on where to go. During these, there are some moments where precise timing is needed to make a jump. If you miss that sweet spot by just a hair, you could be replaying these sections. Another problem I had is that the ending is a little underwhelming. This is somewhat helped by the game's DLC Whistleblower, but it just kind of ends. Don't count on any resolution either because the second game has nothing to do with the events of the first. So I guess what happens next is really just up to everybody's interpretation. It's damn near impossible for me to think of anything else I really disliked. Outlast provides a rich experience for anybody wanting to be immersed and have the shit scared out of them. Red Barrel's truly made a classic here. I'm curious to see how the Outlast trials will fare as it's changing up the formula significantly in a multiplayer style game with heavy Saw vibes. Still not sure when this is coming. I know they're doing beta testing right now with the community, but hopefully it's soon. So there you have it, a video on why I think Outlast is and forever will be an awesome classic horror game. Thank you all for watching.
You made the right choice here, buddy. Hey, you're that bullshit priest's guy, aren't you? His witness or whatever. You must be exhausted. Let's take a break, huh, buddy?